Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And you'll have to excuse my voice. You know, a little over 2 months ago, maybe 2.5 months ago now, I came down with strep throat for the very first time in my life, and there's a little follow up to that. I really hope it's the last time I ever have that stuff. Uh, in fact, I was sharing with someone just yesterday. I said for about a week or so, I laid on the couch in the fetal position, just crying, "Make it stop! Make it stop!" I mean, it was really bad. Well, the problem is that it obviously settled in my throat, strep throat, but I don't know whether it's damaged my vocal cords. I've been to the doctor. Uh, he said he saw inflammation, agitation of my vocal cords, and what have you. He actually told me to get off of coffee. I don't know if that's humanly possible for me or not. I am a coffee addict, but I have cut back on it radically, and I've gone to like half decaf and half calf, and so the voice is some better. At least the voice is not sore. The throat's not sore, and so I'm slowly improving, and yet it's still not where it ought to be. I I have trouble projecting. I have difficulty with producing any volume, and so with all of that said, I'm going to do the very best that I can to share some thoughts with you here on Now TV. And this is what I call my morning musings, by the way. And so anyway, with those issues before us, I hope you'll be patient with me if my voice sounds strained, if I have to stop and cough, because very often I do as I talk. So we have been involved for a good little while in a study of the challenge of Christ. And by the way, thank you so very, very much for all the wonderful comments, especially the private comments of those of you who have been studying along with this study. I really appreciate that. The challenge of Christ is really very simple, it's very profound, and it's very challenging, not to be redundant. Jesus said in John chapter 10, 37 and following, "Do not believe me for my word's sake. Believe me for my works. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me." Now, listen, ladies and gentlemen, I know an awful lot of people. I correspond with them very often on Facebook and in different venues who literally are unaware of how serious the problem is. They've never encountered a Jew who says Jesus cannot be the Messiah because he said he was going to come back in the first century. He did not do it, therefore he's a false prophet. They have never encountered a Muslim, pardon me, who says the same thing. You know, the Muslims have a severe problem because on the one hand they say that Jesus, well, yes, Jesus was a great prophet. Then they turn right around, and I personally heard Louis Farrakhan, a hate-filled preacher of some kind, say Jesus made false prophecies. Well, how can you say Jesus was a prophet of God on the one hand and then turn right around and say that his prophecies failed? Well, Louis Farrakhan went ahead to say Jesus was a dog and a liar. And what was most shocking to me was there was a row of, quote, Christian ministers sitting on the very front row as he gave his speech, and the camera panned every one of them, and all the time that Louis Farrakhan was calling Jesus a dog, a liar, a false teacher, etc., 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 not one of those so-called Christian ministers raised their hand to object. Not one of them even frowned. Not one of them shook their head no. It was like, whatever. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenge of Christ is important. Jesus said, Matthew 16:27 and 28, this is the challenge. The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, and don't forget, that little Greek term, verily I say unto you, or the Greek term, amen, lego humin, is one of the strongest ways to affirm and to reaffirm and to emphasize something that is about to be said that will emphasize something that's just been said. So Jesus said, Matthew 16:28, verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, I'm sure you'll agree with me. There are no 2,000-year-old people that were standing there with Jesus that day, still running around in our world. And yet Jesus said, some in that audience, and according to Mark chapter 8, it was a large audience, but some of that large audience would live to see him coming. Now, listen. If you have the very literalistic view of the coming of the Lord that I once had, okay, if you believe that the coming of the Lord is Jesus as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body who will one day ride a cumulus cloud descending out of heaven with a shout that will be heard around the globe, with the sound of a trumpet that will be heard around the globe as the earth is consumed in a fire, or at least purged by fire in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, then obviously that did not happen literally. But if that's the kind of coming that Jesus was talking about in Matthew 16:27 and 28, then ladies and gentlemen, he did not do that. I don't have to tell you that he didn't do that, because you know he didn't. And the Jews and the Muslims and the atheists, no, he didn't come that way. Just recently on YouTube, I watched a YouTube, I think I mentioned this to you, of a young man, obviously a bitter young man, raised in what he said was a Christian family that was completely consumed with the idea that the coming of the Lord would be just any day now. He said he would get frightened if his mother and his father went into town by themselves and left him home, because he was afraid that the rapture would come and they would be taken. He quoted Matthew 16:27 and 28. He quoted Matthew 24:29 to 34. He quoted several of Jesus' words in which Jesus said his coming was going to be in that century, in that generation. And he said it's more than obvious that Jesus lied. Can you meet that challenge of Christ? Are you able to show that Jesus kept his word? Are you able to show that Jesus did not predict that he was going to come back as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body? I mean, after all, he said he was going to come back in the glory of the Father. And what did that mean? Well, excuse me here. Okay? I wrote a book on this very subject. It is entitled, Like Father, Like Son, on Clouds of Glory. I've shared with you here on this program for the last 2 years how Jesus is coming in the glory of the Father meant that he was going to come as the Father had come before. And make no mistake, in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, the Father had come many, many times. The Father had come with a shout. He had come in flaming fire. He had come with the sound of a trumpet. He had come and destroyed heaven and earth. Now, I think it's pretty obvious he didn't do that literally, physically, visibly. So here is Jesus in Matthew 16:27 and 28 saying he was going to come as the Father had come, in the glory of the Father. The Father had never come literally, visibly, and bodily, had never destroyed literal, physical heaven and earth, Therefore, since Jesus was going to come, since Jesus' coming was to be as the Father had come in the past, that means that Jesus wasn't going to come literally, visibly, physically at the destruction of literal physical heaven and earth. Do yourself a favor. Go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com. Go to my bookstore and order the book Like Father, Like Son. Now, if you live in the continental U.S., if you will order the book, send me a note saying you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. That's going to save you $5. If you live out of the U.S., okay, and we have an awful lot of viewers who do, but if you live outside of the U.S. and you like a PDF copy of this book at a greatly reduced price, contact me and I'll help you out on that on certain conditions. They're not difficult, okay? You just have to agree not to distribute it, not to copy it, not to reproduce it, okay? It's for your personal use only. So anyway, get yourself a copy of Like Father, Like Son on Clouds of Glory. Now then, we have people who tell us, and there are people who genuinely love the Lord. It's just that they were raised believing just like I did. They were raised having the wrong concept of the nature of the day of the Lord. We are told by the dispensational world. Now, the dispensationalists are what we call premillennialists. Now, I'm referring here not to historic premillennialists who disagree with the dispensational premillennialists. Okay, so there's division in the premillennial camp, but in the dispensational camp, we are told that yes, Jesus predicted the establishment of the kingdom. Well, that's Matthew 16, 27, and 28. And he offered that kingdom to the Jews in fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27. Daniel was told 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your holy city. And he lists 6 things: to put away sin, to make the atonement, to finish transgression, to seal vision and prophecy, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to anoint the most holy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, those 6 things involve nothing less than the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection. The establishment of the kingdom. Because after all, the judgment, the coming of the Lord, the resurrection, and the coming of the kingdom, the establishment of the kingdom, are all synchronous events. Just read Revelation chapter 11, 15 and following. And we'll be getting back to that text before long because, my goodness gracious, it's powerful. So, Jesus said those events were to take place in his generation, in the lifetime of those people. Again, our dispensational friends tell us, well, yes, Jesus made the offer. However, when he offered the kingdom to the Jews rejected it. They responded to the offer in unbelief. And as a result of that unbelief, and as a result of that rejection of the offer, God withdrew the kingdom offer. He suspended the prophetic clock countdown. Now look, this is absolutely paradigmatic for the dispensational premillennial world. I have engaged in formal public debate with several dispensationalists. They all affirmed God postponed the establishment of the kingdom. Thomas Ice, with whom I've had 1 formal public debate and 3 radio debates, excuse me, said that the Jewish rejection of the kingdom made it, quote, impossible, unquote, for Jesus to fulfill the prophecies. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the challenge of Christ fails then. If Jesus came to establish the kingdom, and if Jesus came at just the right time, in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, Romans chapter 5, 6, and following affirms that he did, if God is omniscient, knowing all things, then surely he knew that his son was going to be rejected. Right? How could we possibly claim that the Jewish rejection of the kingdom caught God off guard and made God essentially go, oops, wow, I wasn't prepared for this. What am I going to do now? Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll establish the church. I'll set Israel aside for the time being, and I'll establish the church, and then in the last days, I'll rapture the church, and then I'll restore Israel to her rightful place, and I will then establish the kingdom. Pardon me. That's what dispensationalism teaches. By the way, do you take note that dispensationalism derides those of us who reject it as teaching replacement theology? They say, oh, you're teaching that God replaced Israel with the church, but Israel was the apple of God's eye. That's a false doctrine. That's a horrible doctrine. But I want you to catch the power of what I'm about to say. Let me allude once again to Thomas Ice. Thomas Ice, in an internet article, said, it is true that God has currently replaced Israel with the church. It's true. Now, catch this. But, he tells us, one day God will replace the church as his distinctive, chosen covenant people. God will replace the church with Israel once again. So God is going to replace the blood-bought institution of the church with Israel. Folks, could there be a worse replacement doctrine than that? I wrote a book that is the most extensive refutation of the charge of replacement theology that, to my knowledge, has been written. One root, one kingdom, all people, all nations, excuse me. It too is on my website. Now, if you go to my website and if you order one root along with glory, no shipping whatsoever, none whatsoever, I'll refund all of your shipping. Do yourself a favor and get one root, one kingdom, all nations, and like Father, like Son. Now, to continue here. So we are told by our dispensational friends that God postponed the kingdom due to the Jewish rejection. Now, here's something, and let me do this as a reminder because this is so critically important. In the very passage that the dispensational world appeals to, Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27, to postulate a gap between the 26th week of Daniel 9 and the 70th week, Thomas Ice says that there's a gap right there in the text. Really? I've been looking for that gap for years and years and years. No, there is not a gap in Daniel 9, except in regard to the feast days of Israel, which was to be, prophetically, a one-generational period of time. Still in that generation. But in the very prophecy that dispensationalism appeals to for the prophetic countdown, for their gap doctrine, etc., etc., in that very text, again, which they use to justify their doctrine of the postponement of the kingdom because of the Jewish rejection of Jesus, that very text predicted the rejection of Jesus. Daniel 9:26. The Messiah would be cut off in the midst of the 70th week. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please ask yourself the question. If God knew, if God predicted the Jewish rejection and slaying of Jesus, then how, in the name of reason, how in the name of logic, can it possibly be argued that, well, Jesus came to offer the kingdom, but because of the Jewish rejection, he withdrew the offer? How can that be argued? Jesus knew they were going to reject him. Jesus knew, and Jesus predicted. The Son of Man did not come to be ministered to, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. Matthew 20:28. You see, the Father knew and predicted the rejection of Jesus. The Son knew he came to die, ladies and gentlemen. So to reiterate, why would God postpone the kingdom if Jesus came to die, knowing he had to die, knowing the Jews were going to reject him? But you see, as we spent our last video developing, in Psalms chapter 2, God knew and God predicted that Israel was going to reject his Son, but he said he was going to laugh at them. He was going to hold them in derision, and he was going to say, Yet have I set my king on my holy hill Zion. What marvelous, marvelous words. What reassurance we find in these words. Man did not, man cannot thwart God's purposes. Now, I've shared with you 3 passages that affirm that. The second passage in the few moments that I have left here today is Isaiah chapter 42. As we come to this text, I want to make some comments that you may not be familiar with, but which scholars well recognize. This is very, very important to understand. There is an organic unity, an organic link, an inextricable, an inseparable, and an unbreakable bond between Jesus' first coming and his second. You see, one of the reasons people have difficulty sometimes accepting that is because of their view of a perceived, so far, 2,000-year gap between the first and the second coming, based upon the false views about the nature of the coming of the Lord. Remember? 99.9% of all Christians say, well, Jesus hasn't come because he didn't come out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man, didn't put an end of time, etc., etc. Well, because that didn't happen, they fail to see the linkage between his second coming and the first. But you see, when we understand that Jesus' first coming would initiate the work, his second coming would consummate the work, and when we accept the multitudinous New Testament statements about when that second coming was to be, then all of a sudden the conundrum, the problem, the challenge of Christ is met, and we can answer the skeptics. the liberals, the Jews, the Muslims, and the atheists. So, when we talk about the two phases of the singular eschaton, okay, one last days period, Jesus appeared in his incarnation in the last days. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. Okay? So Jesus, in his incarnation, appeared. He initiated the kingdom. He laid the foundation for the kingdom. You know, in Luke chapter 11, Jesus, being accosted by the Jews, said, if I by the finger of God, and you can just imagine him holding up his little pinky because he had just performed miracles. Pardon me. And Jesus said, if I by the finger of God do cast out demons, then surely the kingdom has come upon you. Well, wait a minute. According to Revelation chapter 11, the kingdom would come at the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection. And let's not forget Matthew 16, 27 and 28. The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, folks, that's not his incarnation. He was already there. No, he was talking about the coming of the kingdom at the time of the judgment. So here is Jesus in his incarnation talking about the coming of the kingdom. In Luke chapter 11 he says, and oh, by the way, in Matthew 3 verse 2, John the Baptizer said, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. Okay, there's the initiation aspect of it. The point that I'm making here is that in his incarnation, Jesus set the stage. He initiated the kingdom, but he did not consummate the kingdom in its perfection. And I'm out of time. So next week, we're going to pick up on this incredibly important issue. I'll see you then.